Here's a guy with a weird argument against atheism. He calls it the pink butterfly argument.
So God is a very specific idea within religion.
No, it isn't. It's an idea that is vaguely and inconsistently defined in religion.
And you have to think about how many different things people define as God.
There are a lot of different things that people define as a god. That's precisely why a god is the opposite of a specific idea.
For instance, my vision of Jesus as a teenager, I would call that God. My vision of the white light during my NDE, I would also call that God. Or even the presence of the Holy Spirit that I feel during religious ceremonies or during prayer or meditation, that too I would call God.
So for you, God is not the timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind who created the universe that contemporary apologists talk about? For you, God is a set of sensations, is it?
There's only one way that information from out there gets into the brain. Your sensory organs, your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin act as interpreters. They detect a motley crew of information including photons, air compression waves, molecular concentrations, pressure, texture, temperature, and translate those into the common currency of the brain, electrochemical signals. Everything you experience, every sight, sound, smell, rather than being a direct experience, is an electrochemical rendition in a dark theater. What Eagleman eloquently points out is that all of our subjective experiences are being orchestrated by the organizing power of the brain, but the brain doesn't always get it right. Take, for instance, optical illusions. In these images, you'll see motion, but there is no motion. The motion is being created by your brain and the way in which the brain processes this information. But your brain's ability to create subjective experience doesn't just stop with optical illusions. Consider the color pink. What if I were to tell you that pink does not exist? You see, in our eyes, there are only 3 cones that are dedicated to observing colors: a red cone, blue cone, and a green cone. And your brain creates your experience of colors based on the information that's being supplied by these 3 cones. The result is that at specific times, our minds will create colors that, in fact, do not exist. Take, for instance, the color yellow that you're now seeing on your screen. Scientists have known this about our eyes for quite some time, so when they develop television screens, they don't use the color yellow. They just simply use a tiny bit of red and a tiny bit of green, which is just enough to stimulate the cones in your eyes and convince your brain that you're seeing yellow. And that is in fact what you see. So in reality, there is no yellow light coming off of your computer screen. It's entirely red and green. But it really gets peculiar when we look at pink, because pink is a color that your brain creates when it perceives equal quantities of both red and blue light. The problem with this is that red and blue belong to opposite ends of the electromagnetic spectrum. So as your eye perceives an increasing amount of infrared or an increasing amount of ultraviolet, your brain simply doesn't know what to do with that information, and so it overlaps all of it with the color pink. So objectively speaking, there's no such thing as pink light.
I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, it just goes to show that we can reify things that are not in fact real. And the fact that we know that pink is not real in the sense that this dude means, proves that we can make meaningful distinctions between experiences of real things and experiences that are simply illusory or hallucinatory. If we couldn't, we wouldn't have been able to find out that pink isn't real like red and green are.
Similarly, people who suffer from amputations will report phantom limbs. Their arm might be missing, but they'll feel the sensation of an itch or pain in the arm that's no longer there and doesn't exist. So it's quite clear that our internal experience of reality is not always reliable. Sometimes it's inaccurate and sometimes it gets it flat out wrong. And this internal reality that we're experiencing is what neurologists refer to as the internal model, or perhaps the mental model, if you rather. Essentially, in my opinion, this is just a very educated way of referring to the reality of dreams. Because what do we call a reality that is created by the brain?
If it's created by the brain, I wouldn't call it a reality at all.
According to the Hindus, all the world is little more than a dream conjured up by Vishnu, who sleeps on the cosmic serpent. He dreams a dream, and then that dream rises from his navel in the form of a lotus. Brahman, seated on the lotus, opens his eyes, and we are the stuff of his dreaming. Just imagine for a moment that everyone in the world were incapable of seeing the color pink. And one day, a single individual happens upon a series of methods, a series of religious practices, if you will, that enables him to suddenly see the color pink. He runs back to his community. He says, "My God, I've seen the most wonderful thing. You've all got to come with me. There's this whole new color, and it's called pink," right? And so the people, they run out and they say, "We don't see anything at all." And he says, No, that's fine. All you have to do is perform these methods. You have to participate in these methods, and then the experience of pink will become clear to you." At which point some of the people step forward and they accept his proposal on faith. They say, "Yes, we'll step in and we'll participate." And then subsequently they too see the color pink.
I've done many of the drugs and the rituals that are supposed to reveal some otherwise hidden reality to me, and I didn't see it. I saw nothing that is in any way fundamentally incomparable to the rest of my everyday experiences. I've experienced absolutely nothing I didn't expect to experience. And even if I did, there is a meaningful distinction between illusory or hallucinatory experiences and experiences of things that are not illusory or hallucinatory.
The skeptical and scientific types come into the scene and they say, "Well, where's the proof for this pink? Show us the evidence." Well, then they try to conjure up the electromagnetic spectrum and they look and there's no evidence. They start to ask other people if they can see the color pink, but it seems as if only the people who participate in this guy's methods are capable of seeing this color pink. So the skeptics and the unbelievers, they say, these people are insane, they're nuts, and they dismiss their experience and walk away.
That doesn't actually sound like something many skeptics would do. Plenty of skeptics would give the practices a try to see if they can see for themselves. That's what I did. I tried the practices. I've tried the drugs. I didn't have any mystical or divine experiences. Since that's the case, am I not justified in remaining unconvinced?
Thomas Hobbes wrote, "To say that God is an incorporeal substance is to say in effect that there is no God at all. What alleges he against it but the school of divinity, which I have already answered?" So Thomas Hobbes is asserting that God does not exist because he is not a physical thing, because this is functioning from the assumption, the belief that only physical things are real.
Physical things as opposed to what? What's a non-physical thing?
And we can already talk about the logical fallacy behind this because we experience immaterial realities all the time.
What are immaterial realities?
Some people will say, well, we can stimulate someone's brain and cause an out-of-body experience. This proves and demonstrates that these things are simply the invention of the human brain. But by the same logic, couldn't we equally argue that burnt toast does not exist?
Every time she has a seizure, she smells something burning. Now, if we can provoke that smell by probing the surface of the brain, we'll find the source of the seizures. Mrs. Gold, do you feel anything?
I can see the most wonderful lights.
And now what do you feel?
Did you pour cold water on my hand, Dr. Penfield?
Now what? What is it, Mrs. Gold?
Burnt toast. Dr. Penfield, I can smell burnt toast.
That's a classic piece of Canadiana right there. And no, that doesn't mean burnt toast doesn't exist. We can make a distinction between the sensations we associate with burnt toast and the toast itself. Now you may say that both the scent of the toast we smell when making breakfast is just as much a set of brain activity as the brain activity that is stimulated by a brain surgeon, but the two forms of experience are not indistinguishable. The smell of actual toast is more consistent with other experiences, such as seeing toast, tasting toast, etc. Sure, those could all be illusions, but is that the simplest explanation? It seems to me that the only circumstance in which illusions are the simplest explanation is if other people and instruments can't detect them, and things are happening to the experiencer's brain that are out of the ordinary. This is especially the case if the experience is unusual. That's not the case when you're smelling toast while actually making toast, but is the case if you have a brain tumor or a surgeon is prodding your brain with electrodes. It makes sense to infer the reality of sensory experiences that are discernibly more consistent than dreams, drug hallucinations, and trance-induced visions. They are more reliably predictable and stable in a way that you would expect if they were brain sensations created by an independent reality. We can make a distinction between the common experience of the smell of toast and a hallucinatory or illusory smell of toast. Given that hallucinations consistently seem to occur when the brain is doing something or caused to do something that is quite distinct from its common function, it is entirely reasonable to infer that those experiences are products of the brain itself, while others are products of a brain-independent reality. We may not be able to prove it, but it does seem to be the simplest view.
We could carry on and begin to discuss the myriad of different things that people experience and witness to that are considered to be scientifically impossible. Recently, someone pointed out to me the fascinating story of a musician by the name of Mikey Welsh. Mikey Welsh jokingly posted on Twitter saying that he had had a dream about dying in Chicago of a heart attack and said, I should probably write up my will. Well, creepily enough, about a week and a half later, he did in fact die of a heart attack in Chicago.
Why is coincidence not the simplest, most reasonable interpretation of that? Psychic phenomena of this type and similar types have been pretty extensively tested and found to be no more reliable than random occurrence. A random guess is usually wrong, but can sometimes be correct. One example of a correct prediction tells you absolutely nothing with regard to the reliability of the predictor.
So this is an example of what we call precognitive dreams, dreams about the future. And we don't just have to rely on one isolated instance. In fact, history is replete with examples of this from all different cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, you can find lots of anecdotes. That doesn't mean anything. I'll believe this stuff when you can get a decent sample set of people, ideally tens of thousands, in a lab and show claimed precognitive abilities to be more reliable than chance. Cherry-picking examples, even lots of them, won't convince me.
So if this thing were conjured up by just simply one society, then yeah, we could probably expect it to be there, but we see this witnessed in a variety of different cultures. For instance, Mark Twain had a dream in which he saw his brother lying down in a casket, and roughly about a week later, his brother tragically passed away. The Roman Emperor Marcion reported having a dream of seeing Attila's bow break, and it just so happened that it was that very same night that Attila the Hun died. Joan of Arc is reputed to have prophesied and dreamed about her own martyrdom. And even Abraham Lincoln reported that before he was assassinated, he had a dream in which he was at a funeral. He saw a body in the casket, and when he asked someone at the funeral who it was, they said, the President of the United States. And shortly thereafter, the President was assassinated.
When you compare these few examples to the colossal number of examples of people dreaming about stuff that never ended up happening, the few examples that look like prescience are not very impressive at all. In fact, they look no more impressive than random coincidence.
The research that is emerging is quite exciting. At Princeton University, you have the Global Consciousness Project, and the Global Consciousness Project focuses in on peculiarities in random number generators that seem to surround significant events. There will be a spike in the random numbers generated by these computers right around the time when significant events take place and even ahead of time. So for instance, at 9/11, they recognized an enormous spike in the random number generator that could not be accounted for statistically.
The way the Global Consciousness Project seems to work is that the researchers will see a spike and then look in the news for significant events, and they usually find something because significant events happen literally every day. An independent analysis of the 9/11 data said, "We conclude that the network random number generators produce data consistent with mean chance expectation."
5 years ago, I had the most dramatic experience of my adult life. After combining LSD and Tibetan Buddhist meditation, I achieved a full-fledged out-of-body experience. I shot off into a vast open void of darkness. And there I spoke with an entity entirely composed of red and green light. I was challenged by this entity who said, "You are not permitted to be here." And I carried on by responding, "You will not hold me back from nirvana." I felt as though my very memories began to burn, and I was slipping further and further into the darkness of unconsciousness. I felt as though I was dying and ceasing to exist absolutely in an eternal sense. Just then, as I was dissolving into the void, a white light appeared. It carried a profound feeling that I had not felt in some time. It was the presence of the Holy Spirit that I had learned to recognize as a young man. And I said, "Jesus, what are you doing here?" I was caught up in the light, and I was awash with the single greatest moment of ecstasy I've ever experienced. I subsequently re-entered my body through a star that appeared in the void, and when I opened my eyes, I felt as though I had been born again, and all the world was a perfect paradise. I could not die, and my consciousness was indistinguishable from the consciousness of everyone else. I felt as though I had existed from the very beginning, and I would never cease to exist. I was in God, and God was in me.
I've never experienced anything like that on LSD or psilocybin, but even if I did, why would it not be more reasonable to interpret this as being a natural interaction of my brain with drugs? Why would it be as reasonable or more reasonable to infer that I was experiencing some other reality or some other plane of existence?
So if you're going to reference the physical reality as if it's somehow different than that of the spirit world, then I would challenge you to prove to me that there is such thing as the color pink.
As I said, the very fact that we can discern between colors which are real and those which are not proves that such a distinction is meaningful. If it weren't, then we wouldn't be able to know that pink isn't real in the sense this guy described. In fact, this argument works against his conclusion. He's taking a distinction between something real and something illusory and trying to use it as evidence that such distinctions can't be made. How does that make any sense?
I think Lao Tzu said it best when he wrote, "Once upon a time I dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of my happiness as a butterfly, unaware that I was myself. Soon I awakened, and there I was, veritably myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming that I am a man."
And that's silly. We can clearly discern between dreams and wakeful experiences. I've never questioned whether I'm dreaming or not and been mistaken in my conclusion. When I'm awake and I ask myself whether I'm dreaming, I always conclude that I'm not. When I'm actually dreaming and I ask myself whether I'm dreaming, I have always concluded that I am. When it occurs to me to ask the question, I've always been able to determine which is the case. I don't know if you've heard, but I do have a Patreon.